Jessica had always been drawn to helping others. As a young doctor, she worked tirelessly in the emergency room of one of the city's busiest hospitals. Her life was simple but fulfilling: long hours, dedicated patients, and the satisfaction of saving lives. One stormy night, as she made her way home from a grueling shift, she noticed something strange in a dark alleyway near her apartment. The city was known for its crime, but this wasn't something she could just ignore. Her doctor's instincts kicked in. As she got closer, she realized there was a man lying on the ground, bleeding profusely. Without a second thought, she rushed to his side. He was unconscious, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but the wound in his chest was unmistakable, a bullet hole. "Stay with me," she muttered as she ripped open his shirt and tried to assess the damage. The wound was bad, very bad, but it wasn't impossible to treat. She knew she couldn't take him to a hospital. It was too risky, especially with the nature of his injuries. This wasn't an ordinary street fight. This was something much more dangerous. Jessica had no idea who the man was, but his tattoos, the expensive watch on his wrist, and the severity of the situation hinted that he wasn't just anyone. Without another second to waste, she called a cab, instructing the driver to take her back to her apartment. She had no time to explain the unconscious man bleeding in the back seat. Once home, she carried him inside with all the strength she had. The next hours were a blur of medical procedures, bandaging, and trying to stabilize him. Jessica's hands were steady, her focus unshakable, despite the fact that her heart was racing. She had no idea who this man was or what he had done, but she couldn't just leave him to die. Days passed before the stranger woke up. Jessica had been monitoring his progress closely, and his condition had slowly improved. His fever had broken, and the bleeding had stopped, but he was still weak. She didn't know what to expect when he opened his eyes for the first time, but she wasn't prepared for the intensity in his gaze. "Where am I?" His voice was raspy, weak from days of unconsciousness, but there was an edge of authority in his tone. "You're safe," Jessica replied, her voice soft yet firm. "You were shot. I found you in the alley and brought you here." The man's eyes darted around the room, taking in his surroundings. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his chest made him wince. "Lie down," she instructed. "You're not in any condition to move right now. You're lucky to be alive." His eyes locked onto hers, suspicious but grateful. "You shouldn't have helped me." Jessica raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his attitude. "If I hadn't, you'd be dead. You don't need to thank me, but I'm a doctor. It's my job to save lives." He was silent for a moment, studying her. "What's your name?" "Jessica. And you?" For a long moment, he hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell her the truth. Finally, he spoke, "Ace." That name sent a chill down her spine. She had heard rumors about Ace Moretti, the infamous gang boss who ruled the underground with an iron fist. If this was the same man, she had just saved someone who was feared throughout the city. But in that moment, he wasn't a dangerous criminal. He was her patient, and she had saved his life. As Ace recovered, he remained in Jessica's apartment. She had been hesitant at first, knowing who he was, but there was something about him that intrigued her. He was dangerous, yes, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. Over time, he began to open up to her. Late-night conversations over simple meals revealed pieces of his life. His rise to power, the dangerous world he had built, and the countless enemies he had made along the way. Jessica listened carefully, her feelings torn between fear and compassion. She knew he wasn't a good man, but there was more to him than the ruthless gang boss everyone feared. Ace, on the other hand, found himself drawn to Jessica in ways he hadn't expected. She was different from anyone he had ever known. Strong, intelligent, and fiercely independent. Her willingness to help him, despite knowing who he was, confused him. People usually wanted something from him, but Jessica seemed to only want him to get better. As the days turned into weeks, Ace's physical wounds began to heal, but something else was happening. He wasn't used to relying on others, but Jessica had saved him, both physically and emotionally. She treated him like a human being, not like the monster everyone else saw. One evening, as they sat on her couch, the tension between them finally broke. Ace leaned in, his hand gently brushing her cheek. "You should have left me in that alley," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. Jessica shook her head, her heart racing. "No, I couldn't do that." Their lips met in a heated kiss, months of unspoken tension finally spilling over. In that moment, everything changed. Ace stayed longer than either of them had anticipated. His world outside was dangerous, and while he healed, he found comfort in the simple life Jessica led. For the first time in years, he wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder or making deals to stay alive. In Jessica's small apartment, he felt at peace. But peace couldn't last forever. One morning, while Jessica was at work, Ace's past came crashing back in the form of a phone call. One of his trusted men had tracked him down, warning him that his enemies were closing in. They had found out he was still alive, and they weren't going to stop until they finished the job. Ace knew he had to leave. He couldn't put Jessica in danger any longer. But the thought of leaving her, of walking away from the life they had begun to build together, filled him with dread. When Jessica returned home that evening, Ace was waiting for her, his face serious. "I have to go," he said, his face serious. "I have to go," he said, his voice rough. Jessica's heart sank. "Go where?" "It's not safe here anymore. My enemies know I'm alive. I can't stay and put you in danger." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You don't have to leave. We can figure this out together." Ace shook his head. "No, Jessica, you don't understand. I can't drag you into my world. You deserve better than that." Jessica stepped forward, her hands gripping his. "I don't care about your world. I care about you." For a moment, Ace was silent, torn between the life he had always known and the new one he had begun to imagine with her. Finally, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I'll come back for you. I promise." And with that, he was gone, leaving Jessica standing in her apartment, wondering if she would ever see him again. It had been 3 months since Ace left Jessica's apartment, and life had returned to its usual routine for her: work at the hospital, long shifts, and lonely nights. But despite the quiet, there was an emptiness that lingered. Ace's absence gnawed at her heart. She had never expected to fall for someone like him, but the connection they had forged in those days together was undeniable. Every night, she found herself thinking about him, wondering if he was safe, if he was even alive. Then one night, after a long shift, Jessica returned to her apartment to find a shadowy figure waiting at her doorstep. Her heart raced as she approached, but when she saw the familiar silhouette, she froze. It was Ace. He stood there, looking like he had been through hell. His clothes were disheveled, his face bruised and cut, but there was a fire in his eyes. "Jessica," he said softly, his voice rough from exhaustion. Without a second thought, she rushed forward, her arms wrapping around him tightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just held on to each other, the months of separation melting away in that embrace. "Are you okay?" she finally whispered, pulling back to examine his injuries. "I'm fine," Ace replied, though his body told a different story. "I had to come back. I couldn't stay away." Jessica guided him inside, her mind racing with questions. Why had he returned? What had happened to him? But most of all, she wanted to know if he was planning on staying. As she treated his wounds, Ace remained quiet, watching her with a soft intensity that made her heart ache. "I had to tie up loose ends," he explained after a long silence. "But it's done now. I've made enemies, and they're not going to stop coming after me. But I couldn't leave you behind." Jessica met his gaze, her hands trembling as she finished bandaging his arm. "So, what now?" Ace sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. All I know is I need you. I can't do this without you, Jessica." The weight of his words hung in the air. Jessica felt torn between fear for their safety and the undeniable pull of her feelings for him. She had spent months convincing herself that Ace was a part of her past. But now, with him sitting in front of her, It was clear that he was her future. Ace's return wasn't without consequence. The men who had been hunting him had gotten closer, and now, with him back in Jessica's life, the danger was more real than ever. Ace had tried to shield her from it, but as days passed, the tension grew. Jessica could see it in the way he constantly checked the windows, the way his phone never stopped buzzing with messages from his men. His world was closing in on them, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they were dragged into it. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside caught their attention. Ace's body went rigid, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he had stashed under the couch. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she moved closer to him. "Stay here," Ace commanded, his voice low but firm. He stood up, moving toward the window to peek outside. His jaw clenched, and he turned back to her, his expression grim. "We have to go. Now." Jessica didn't ask questions. She grabbed her coat, her heart racing as Ace led her out of the apartment and into the night. They slipped into the alley behind the building, moving quickly as the sound of footsteps approached from the other side. They barely made it to Ace's car when the first gunshot rang out. Jessica ducked instinctively, her hands trembling as she followed Ace's lead. He drove fast, weaving through the streets of the city with the precision of a man who had done this before. Jessica's mind raced, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. This wasn't just about Ace anymore. Her life was in danger too. After what felt like hours, Ace finally pulled into a secluded garage, far from the city center. The silence that followed was deafening. "We're safe for now," Ace muttered, running a hand over his face. He turned to Jessica, his expression softening as he saw the fear in her eyes. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this." Jessica shook her head, her voice shaky but determined. "I chose this. I chose you." In the following weeks, Ace and Jessica moved into a safe house. It was hidden deep in the countryside, far from the city and the reach of Ace's enemies. For the first time in months, they had a semblance of peace. But Jessica knew it was temporary. The world Ace came from was unforgiving, and no matter how far they ran, it would eventually catch up to them. One night, as they sat by the fire in the small cabin, Ace opened up in a way he hadn't before. He told her about his past, how he had risen to power in the criminal underworld, the betrayals that had shaped him, and the decisions that had led him down a path of violence and crime. It wasn't an easy conversation, but Jessica listened, her heart breaking for the man he had become and the boy he had once been. "I never wanted this life," Ace admitted, staring into the flames. "But once you're in, there's no way out." Jessica reached for his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "You can still get out. We can figure it out together." Ace looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and doubt. "I don't deserve you, Jessica. You're too good for this life. Too good for me." Jessica shook her head, her grip tightening on his hand. "I don't care about your past. I care about who you are now, and I'm not going to let you face this alone." But their fragile peace was shattered the next morning when Ace received a call from one of his men. Someone in his organization had betrayed him, leaking his location to his enemies. They were coming for him, and there wasn't much time. Ace's expression was cold and hard as he hung up the phone. "We need to leave. Now." The sun had barely risen when they packed their bags and prepared to flee. Ace was tense, his mind racing with plans and contingencies, but Jessica could see the fear behind his eyes. He was trying to protect her, but they both knew this was a battle they couldn't avoid any longer. As they loaded the car, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Ace cursed under his breath, pulling Jessica behind him as several black SUVs pulled up to the cabin. The doors swung open, and armed men spilled out, their guns trained on Ace and Jessica. "This is it," Ace whispered, his hand tightening around his gun. Jessica's heart raced, but she refused to let fear consume her. She had been by Ace's side through it all, and she wasn't about to leave him now. The leader of the group stepped forward, a cold smirk on his face. "Ace Moretti, we've been looking for you." Ace raised his gun, his expression steely. "I'm not going down without a fight." Before anyone could react, a gunshot echoed through the clearing. The man in front of them fell to the ground, and chaos erupted. Ace moved quickly, taking out the men one by one with precision, but they were outnumbered. Jessica ducked behind the car, her heart pounding in her chest as the gunfire continued. She wanted to help, to do something, but all she could do was pray that Ace would make it through this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the gunfire stopped. Ace stood alone in the clearing, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The bodies of his enemies lay scattered around him, but he was alive. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood as the echoes of the gunfire faded. Jessica slowly stepped out from behind the car, her legs trembling as she took in the sight of Ace standing among the fallen men. He was covered in blood, some his own, some from his enemies. But he stood tall, his eyes sharp and alert, scanning the area for any remaining threats. Jessica rushed toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. She threw her arms around him, holding him tightly as if afraid he might vanish. Ace's muscles tensed at first, but then he relaxed, his arms wrapping around her in a firm embrace. I thought I'd lost you," Jessica whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. "You won't lose me that easily," Ace replied, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. There was an undercurrent of exhaustion and pain, both physical and emotional. As they pulled apart, Jessica noticed the deep cut on his side, blood soaking through his shirt. "You're hurt. We need to get you inside." Ace shook his head. "There's no time. They'll send more men when they realize these didn't come back. We need to leave. Now." "But you're bleeding," she insisted, her hands hovering over his wound. Ace grabbed her wrist gently, his eyes softening. "It's nothing I can't handle. I've had worse. We need to focus on getting out of here." Jessica bit her lip, her mind racing with worry, but she knew Ace was right. They were still in danger. She helped him load the last of their bags into the car, and with one last glance at the cabin that had been their refuge, they sped away, leaving behind the chaos and death. As they drove down the winding roads, the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Jessica's mind was a whirlwind of questions. What would happen now? Where would they go? Would they ever be safe? "Ace," she began hesitantly, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. "What are we going to do now? We can't keep running forever." Ace's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I know," he said after a long pause, "but I'm not going to let them take us down. I'm going to end this once and for all." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I've been playing defense for too long," Ace explained, his voice low and determined. "It's time I take control of this situation. I'm going after the man who's been hunting me." Jessica stared at him, her chest tightening with fear. "But that's suicide. You don't even know how many men he has or where they are." "I know enough," Ace replied, his eyes hard. "I have contacts, and I've been tracking him for months. He's the one pulling the strings, and if I can take him out, the rest will fall apart." Jessica's heart raced as she processed his words. This was a dangerous game Ace was playing, and she didn't want to lose him. But she also knew there was no changing his mind once it was made up. "If you're going to do this," she said softly, "then I'm coming with you." Ace's eyes flicked toward her, surprise evident in his gaze. "No, it's too dangerous. You've been through enough already." Jessica shook her head. "I'm not letting you go into this alone. I've stood by you through everything so far, and I'm not backing down now." For a moment, Ace stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he nodded. "All right, but if things get too dangerous, you have to promise me you'll leave. I can't lose you, Jessica." "I promise," she whispered, though in her heart, she knew she wouldn't leave his side no matter what. Ace's contacts led them to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of a distant city. It was a place where shady deals went down, and where men like the one Ace was hunting operated in the shadows. Ace had spent the last few days gathering intel, making sure he knew exactly who they were dealing with. As they approached the warehouse, the tension between them grew. Ace's normally calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a cold focus that unnerved Jessica. She could see the weight of everything they had been through wearing on him, and it only made her more determined to stand by his side. They parked the car a few blocks away, making their way through the dark, narrow alleys that surrounded the warehouse. Ace moved like a predator, his every step careful and calculated. Jessica followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. When they reached the back entrance, Ace paused, turning to her. "Stay close," he whispered, "and be ready for anything." Jessica nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the small gun Ace had given her for protection. She had never imagined her life would lead her to a moment like this, sneaking into a dangerous criminal's lair with a man she had fallen in love with, despite the darkness that surrounded him. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with tension. Men in suits stood around, talking in hushed tones as they exchanged money and drugs. Ace led Jessica through the maze of crates and machinery, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of their target. Then, they saw him. Sitting in a makeshift office at the back of the warehouse was the man Ace had been hunting, Dominic Vieira. He was surrounded by bodyguards, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. Ace's jaw tightened as he took in the sight of the man who had tried to destroy his life. "Stay here," he whispered to Jessica. "I'll take care of this." Before she could protest, Ace was already moving toward Dominic, his gun drawn. Jessica watched in horror as the scene unfolded in slow motion. "Ace Moretti," Dominic sneered as he looked up, clearly expecting him. "I wondered when you'd show your face." "You're done, Vieira," Ace growled, his gun aimed at the man's chest. "This ends tonight." Dominic's smile was cold and unfeeling. "You really think you can just walk in here and kill me? You're outnumbered, Moretti." Jessica's heart raced as she watched Ace stand his ground, refusing to back down despite the odds. She knew she had to do something, but fear paralyzed her. Then, without thinking, she stepped out of the shadows, raising her gun and pointing it at one of Dominic's men. "Step away from him," she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The room went silent as everyone turned to look at her. Ace's eyes widened in shock, but there was also a glimmer of pride in his gaze. Chaos erupted as gunfire filled the warehouse. Dominic's men rushed toward Ace and Jessica, but Ace was faster, taking them out with precision and skill. Jessica stayed by his side, her heart racing as she fired at anyone who came too close. In the midst of the chaos, Ace and Dominic finally faced off. The two men circled each other, guns drawn, their hatred palpable in the air. "You should have stayed in hiding, Moretti," Dominic spat. "You've brought this on yourself." Ace smirked, his grip on the gun steady. "I've been hiding long enough. It's time I finish this." The sound of gunfire echoed through the warehouse as the two men engaged in a deadly duel. Jessica watched in horror as Ace took a hit to the shoulder, blood pouring from the wound. But he didn't falter. With a final, precise shot, Ace took Dominic down, the crime boss collapsing to the ground in a lifeless heap. The room fell silent, the last of Dominic's men either dead or fleeing. Jessica rushed to Ace's side, her hands shaking as she pressed them to his bleeding wound. "We did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're free." Ace winced in pain but smiled, his hand reaching up to touch her cheek. "Thanks to you." With Dominic dead, Ace's enemies scattered. The power vacuum left behind would take time to fill, but for now, Ace and Jessica were safe. They returned to the countryside, where the peace of the open fields and quiet nights brought them a sense of calm they hadn't felt in months. But the scars of their ordeal remained. Ace struggled with the weight of everything he had done, the lives he had taken, and the darkness that had once consumed him. Jessica stood by him, her love unwavering, but she knew that the path to healing would be long and difficult. One night, as they sat on the porch of their new home, Ace turned to her, his expression somber. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. Jessica frowned, taking his hand in hers. "Don't say that. You've changed, Ace. You fought for us, for our future." That's all that matters. Ace sighed, his gaze distant. I'm trying, Jessica, but sometimes I wonder if I can ever leave that part of my life behind. You already have, she whispered, leaning in to kiss him softly. You're not the man you were. You're better than that. Ace smiled, pulling her into his arms. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. With Jessica by his side, maybe, just maybe, he could find peace. In the aftermath of the violent showdown at the warehouse, Ace and Jessica settled into a new routine. The quiet countryside offered them a semblance of normalcy, but the scars of their ordeal ran deep. The constant reminders of the past, the flashes of gunfire, the echoes of screams, played like a relentless loop in their minds. Ace was determined to make amends for the life he had led, but it wasn't easy. He spent his days trying to atone for his past actions, reaching out to those he had wronged and working to dismantle the remnants of his criminal empire. For Jessica, it was a time of healing, both physically and emotionally. The trauma of their experiences had taken a toll, and she found solace in the calm of their new home, though the fear of the past still lurked in her mind. One afternoon, as Ace worked on organizing files related to his former organization, Jessica came to him with a worried expression. "Ace, we need to talk." Ace looked up from his desk, his face weary but attentive. "What's on your mind?" Jessica took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I've been thinking about us, about our future, and I'm not sure where we stand anymore." Ace's heart sank. He had been so focused on making things right, on rebuilding his life, that he hadn't considered how Jessica was feeling. He stood up, crossing the room to her. "Jessica, I know I've been distant," he said softly. "I've been so caught up in trying to fix everything that I didn't realize how it was affecting you." Jessica looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I know you're trying, Ace, but it feels like we're drifting apart. I'm scared that all of this, everything we've been through, will tear us apart." Ace's heart ached as he saw the fear in her eyes. He took her hands in his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want to lose you. You've been my anchor through all of this. Without you, I don't know where I'd be." Jessica squeezed his hands, her tears falling freely. "I love you, Ace, but we need to find a way to heal together, to rebuild our relationship. I can't keep going like this, with all this uncertainty." Ace nodded, his own tears brimming in his eyes. "You're right. We need to work through this together. I'm committed to doing whatever it takes to make things right." They spent the evening talking, opening up about their fears and hopes for the future. It was a long and emotional conversation, but it was the beginning of a new chapter for them. They vowed to support each other, to be honest and open, and to face their challenges as a team. The months following their heart-to-heart were filled with efforts to rebuild their lives and their relationship. Ace continued to distance himself from his criminal past, focusing on philanthropy and rebuilding his reputation. Jessica supported him every step of the way, working to overcome her own fears and anxieties. However, the past was not so easily left behind. One evening, as they were enjoying a quiet dinner at home, the tranquility was shattered by a knock on the door. Ace's face went pale as he exchanged a worried glance with Jessica. "I'll get it," he said, though his voice was uncertain. Jessica followed him to the door, her heart pounding as Ace opened it to reveal a man from his past, one of his former associates. The man, Victor, had an aura of menace about him, his eyes scanning the room with a cold, calculating gaze. "Ace Moretti," Victor said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I see you're still alive." Jessica could see the tension in Ace's body as he tried to keep his composure. "What do you want, Victor?" Victor's gaze shifted to Jessica, a smirk playing on his lips. "Just came to see how things were going. I heard you've been trying to clean up your act. Thought I'd drop by to remind you that your past has a way of catching up." Ace's eyes narrowed, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm done with that life. If you're here to cause trouble, you need to leave." Victor's smile widened, but there was a cruel edge to it. "Oh, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to let you know that there are others who aren't so forgiving. You've made enemies, Ace, and they won't forget." With that, Victor turned and walked away, leaving Ace and Jessica in stunned silence. The encounter had left Jessica shaken, her fears about the past resurfacing with a vengeance. "That was just a warning," Ace said, his voice strained. "There will be more. I need to be prepared." Jessica's heart ached as she saw the burden weighing on Ace's shoulders. "We can't keep living like this, Ace. We need to find a way to put this all behind us." Ace nodded, determination burning in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes. I won't let our past destroy our future." As the days turned into weeks, Ace and Jessica continued to face the challenges of their past. The threats from Ace's former associates were constant, but Ace remained resolute in his efforts to distance himself from his criminal past. With Jessica's support, he continued to make strides in rebuilding his reputation and focusing on positive contributions to society. One day, as they walked through a local park, Jessica looked at Ace with a thoughtful expression. "You've come so far, Ace. I'm proud of you." Ace squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the gratitude he felt. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my strength, my reason to change." Their relationship had grown stronger through the trials they had faced. They learned to communicate openly and honestly, to support each other through the darkest moments. Their love had become a beacon of hope in the midst of adversity. One evening, as the sun set and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, Ace took Jessica to a picturesque overlook. He had planned a special evening for her, hoping to show her how much she meant to him. As they stood together, Ace took a deep breath, pulling out a small box from his pocket. Jessica's eyes widened in surprise as he knelt down on one knee, opening the box to reveal a beautiful ring. "Jessica," Ace began, his voice filled with emotion, "you've been my rock, my light in the darkness. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Jessica's eyes as she looked at the man who had come to mean so much to her. The love they shared had been tested in ways she never imagined, but it had only made their bond stronger. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." As Ace slipped the ring onto her finger, they embraced, their hearts full of hope for the future. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they knew they could face it together. They had overcome so much, and their love had emerged stronger than ever. As they stood on that overlook, the sun setting behind them, Ace and Jessica knew that their journey was far from over. But with each other by their side, they were ready to face whatever the future held. Their love had triumphed over adversity, and they were ready to begin a new chapter of their lives, one filled with hope, redemption, and a renewed sense of purpose. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.